Well, today we are going to talk about, in Proverbs chapter 1 of 21, strategies, wealth-building strategies. Now, for our conversation, for the most part, I'm going to be thinking about wealth. When I use the word wealth, I'm going to be talking about money. But I think you would agree, wealth could be a lot of things. It's the relationships that we have in our life, right? It's our health. There's just a lot of things that could make up wealth. And so maybe even in the conversation, as we look at what the Bible writer has to say about how to build wealth in our life, you can think through these strategies through these various lenses of money and relationships and even your own physical health. So here's the first wealth building strategy that we're going to talk about today. Point number 1 in your app notes. If you're taking notes, write this down, and that is this: good planning. Good planning is the first wealth building strategy that Proverbs chapter 1 is going to tell us to apply in our life. Now look at verse 5 there in your app notes or in your Bible. The Bible writer says this. He says, good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty. Now, with a show of hands, how many of you would consider yourself to be an impulse shopper? Anybody? Okay, a few of you in the house. Well, you say, Pastor Mike, what do you mean? Well, when you see a sign that says on sale, for example, does it grab your eye? You know, are you tempted to maybe take a look at what is being offered? Or here's a good telltale sign of, I think, sometimes an impulse shopper. Have you ever heard yourself say the phrase, you wouldn't believe at how much money I saved when I bought this? Right? The regular price was, but I got it for, aren't I a good shopper? Or when you're bored with nothing to do, are you prone to visit maybe the Amazon website to kind of see what kind of deals? So one of the temptations that the devil loves to throw at us, and I don't know if you're prey to this or not, it's hasty shortcuts. Finish this statement for me. If it's too good to be true, if it feels like it's too good to be true, it probably is, right? You know, a few months ago while traveling home on my motorcycle trip, I spent a night in Las Vegas, and I noticed that Las Vegas continues to build new hotels and improve their old ones. Why is that? It's because the gamblers are not winning, are they? But the house is. Friends, the Bible advises us here that hasty shortcuts, get-rich-quick schemes rarely work out. But good planning, Solomon counsels, coupled with hard work, will lead to prosperity. So part of the good planning is, I think, even just entrusting or leaning upon those in our life who are really good at managing finances. So do you all have a financial planner? You know, are you working with somebody? Last night I was working on the pickup, and I was out in the front of our house. Robin's got this F-150 pickup, and the gas gauge hasn't worked for like 2 years, and I finally decided I'm going to figure out the electrical on this pickup. And while I was out there, this young salesman came by selling solar, and we have solar already, so it led to this conversation. And if you're a salesman in solar, you can make generally pretty good income on the commissions. And so I asked him the simple question. I said, are you working with the financial planner? You know, are you working with somebody to help you work with your taxes and your pension and whatnot? And he said, no. And I said, well, as you make your sales and as you start to make money, if you feel like you want some advice or I can come on by, knock on my door, and I can put you in touch with people. And so I would say the same thing for those of you. I would imagine most of you probably have a financial planner that you're working with. But if you're not, please talk to me, and I can point you, give you some options for you to at least talk to. Why? Because planning, right? Good planning, Solomon advises us, is one strategy for wealth building. A second strategy number 2, for wealth building that we're told here in Proverbs chapter 21 is a strategy that I'm calling pleasure moderation. Pleasure moderation. Look at verse 17. He says, those who love pleasure become poor. Those who love wine and luxury will never be rich. Are you all familiar with the term leakage? Have I talked about leakage? I'm not really sure where I learned this term from. Years ago, it could have been from Ron Blue, who is a financial investment counselor, or maybe more recently, Dave Ramsey. How many of you are familiar with Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University? A lot of us have been through that. Dave Ramsey is a popular financial coach. He has a radio station and even, I don't know, it might have been on TV for a while, where he offers kind of sage advice on eliminating debt and building wealth. And in fact, just a fun fact, if you've never been through Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University, which is a course that we have offered in the past, a fun fact is people who start on Ramsey's Financial Peace University, if they follow the advice, within the first 3 months, the average person eliminates $5,300 in debt within the first 90 days of his plan. So if you're looking for a plan, good planning, really strategize, with trying to get a handle on debt as well as wealth building, Ramsey might be a good place to start. But leakage is a term that I use quite a bit, and David and Beto hear me share a lot about this in our weekly encounters. Leakage is what I would call those incidental expenditures that peck away at our income. For example, that $2 cup of coffee every day at the drive-thru on your way to work, right? It adds up. I don't think can you even get a cup of coffee for $2 anymore? But $2 times 365 days is how much? $730, right? Which is like 6 months of car insurance or 6 months of a utility bill. And if you don't have a lot of income, or at least extra income, those expenditures, those little bitty incidental expenditures, start to add up. When we go out for dinner at a restaurant and you order a $4 Coke with your meal, or you splurge on a beer or maybe a glass of wine. Really, when trying to build wealth and manage debt, those kind of expenditures at a restaurant, I call leakage. Drink water, right? Water's better for you anyway. Now, it's not that you don't treat yourself to a nice dinner. It's not that you don't go out to the movies and enjoy a night out with friends and family. But I'm just saying, part of wealth building, and many of you have learned this in your own life, it involves pleasure moderation. Years ago I learned that you can pay now and play later, which means you can pay the price, you can make the sacrifices now, and then later with compounding, you get to play, or you can play now and you will pay later. So it's pleasure moderation. Because the temptation of pleasure indulgence of an unrestricted pleasure lifestyle, and many of you know this to be true, you've applied this in your own life, it will diminish and steal your wealth. Here in this Bible verse, Solomon, brothers and sisters, warns us that the danger of caring only for the pleasures of the present time and not saving for the future will harm you. A couple of weeks we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 23. In fact, Proverbs chapter 23 we are going to be set to tackle on October the 9th. But on October the 9th, we're going to have a special guest with us. And I think I'm going to have a conversation. It'll probably be at least a half an hour. So we probably really won't get into Proverbs chapter 23. And our guest that morning is going to be Police Chief Ron Lawrence. And so Ron's going to come in. I've asked him to come in, and we're going to sit down, and we're going to talk about a lot. And I just felt like, and I talked with my board and stuff, and I feel like, and the staff said, I feel like this is such a special opportunity for us. You guys probably don't really want to hear from me for a morning anyways. But we'll talk about the Bible, and we're going to talk about faith, and we're going to talk about law enforcement and how that's changed. And so put October 20 or October 9th on your calendar for sure. It's already there, but make sure you're here. But in Proverbs chapter 23, which was that Sunday, this is what we read in verses 20 and 21. Solomon says this. He says, do not carouse with drunkards and gluttons. In other words, he says, be careful about carousing with people who love to eat and drink. He says, for they are on their way to poverty. Too much sleep clothes a person with rags. So friends, what King Solomon is advising us here is he's saying is good planning coupled with pleasure moderation. It's not that you don't enjoy pleasure. It's just you do it in moderation are two solid strategies for wealth building. Strategy number 3. A third strategy that Solomon advises us here in Proverbs chapter 1 involves the strategy of purposely save and share. Purposely save and share, which is an interesting combination. Look at verse 20 in your Bible. Proverbs 21, verse 20. Solomon says, the wise have wealth and luxury, but fools spend whatever they get. Again, that's that pleasure moderation piece, right? You know, I wonder for how many of you the word budget is a swear word in your vocabulary. King Solomon advises that purposely saving and sharing is a strategy for building financial wealth. You know I've talked about this in the past, but when I was a child growing up, my mom and dad taught me the principle. It was called the 10-10-80 principle. The 10-10-80 principle. And maybe your parents taught many of you the same thing. And basically, what my parents taught me was that when they would give me my weekly allowance, when I would mow the lawn or do yard work or whatever my responsibilities were as a child growing up, my parents would give me a weekly allowance, and they taught me that 10% went into my piggy bank, 10% went into the offering plate at church or Sunday school, and then 80% I could use and spend however I wanted. And so growing up as a kid, my allowance was first 25 cents, and then I eventually graduated to $1 out of peer pressure because all my other friends were getting $1. And I said, come on, Mom, Dad, you gotta raise the ante. So 10 cents of my dollar went into my piggy bank. I had this little piggy bank. 10 cents went into the offering bag at Sunday school or, at church. And then 80% generally was spent down at the local grocery store on candy. When my savings started to grow, I can remember using my money and my savings for special purposes like a camping knife. Or I would buy these vinyl records. You remember these little 9-inch vinyl records, to listen to? My first vinyl record that I ever purchased was in 1973, and it was the song Monster Mash. You remember that song? Can I sing? I'll sing. It goes like this. He did the mash. You can join with me. He did the Monster Mash. The Monster Mash. It was a graveyard smash. He did the mash. He did the Monster Mash, right? Out from his coffin, Drax's voice did ring. Seemed he was troubled by just one thing. He opened the lid and he shook his fist and said, whatever happened to my Transylvania twist? He did the mash. He did the monk. You get it, right? It was a hit. But that's how I would save my money. That's to buy stuff like the Monster Mash. And friends, really what the Bible advises us here is that there's value in purposely saving and sharing. Because we talk about all the time here at Palm Harvest, the happiest people in life are not the takers, but rather who? The givers. Proverbs 21, verse 26, look at it. Solomon writes, some people are always greedy for more, but the godly love to give. Would you agree with me when I suggest that both saving and giving is a discipline? Saving and giving is a discipline of the heart. Saving and giving is a discipline of the mind, right? Saving and giving must be practiced with purposeful intentionality, which is one reason why having a budget, a good planning system, is so helpful for building wealth, because it really, what it does is it forces you, as many of you know, and maybe why I hate budgets, is because it forces us to prioritize our spending. Because when you can learn, and I can learn, the discipline of prioritized spending with God's help, what it helps us defeat is the temptation of what I call indiscriminate spending. There's purposeful spending, but the temptation is indiscriminate spending. Friends, God entrusts his wealth for you and I to steward. You know, you can't take it with you, but God calls us to steward it well. And one of the ways that King Solomon offers us in order for our lives to be benefited is that there's a balance between saving and giving. Well, you say, well, Mike, why don't I was thinking about this morning. He said, why don't I just take what I normally give and just use it on myself, right? What's the difference? If I'm going to give away 10% anyways, why can't I just use that on my own stuff? And I would say, I don't really know. There's a lot about God's laws and principles that I don't like. I don't understand gravity, but I know that if I drop my phone right now, it's going to, gravity, right? It's there. And there's something about a principle. There's something about a principle of giving away, of tithing. Jesus says, if you're faithful with little, I will entrust you with much, right? There's something about that, of trusting God. And so when we give, obviously, God's going to develop our faith. God's going to develop our capacity to be other-focused and not just on ourselves. Part of wealth building involves purposefully saving and giving. And then finally, strategy number 4. The final wealth building strategy that Solomon counsels us here in Proverbs chapter 21 is to live our life with a God sufficiency. Live your life with a God sufficiency. Look at what verse 6 teaches. He says, wealth created by a lying tongue is a vanishing mist and a deadly trap. Church, when a person lies, when a person fails to tell the truth, when a person fudges on the facts in order to close a business deal, who is that person depending on? Are they depending upon God, or are they depending upon themselves? Themselves, right? I propose that self-sufficiency is a real temptation that you and I face every single day. Am I going to do things in my own strength? With my own wisdom? Or am I going to trust God to lead me and guide me and ultimately give me success? You know, this past week I've been wrenching on my motorcycle. I've got a gas gauge issue. I fixed one problem on my motorcycle and I created another problem in my motorcycle. And it's all electrical, and I don't really get electrical, but I'm beginning to understand electrical, which is why I said I'm going to work on the pickup, because I finally get it. Now I fixed the gas gauge, and so I got a gas gauge after 2 years it's broken, but I still haven't figured out my motorcycle thing. And throughout the process, I often will, all of a sudden I'll hear this whisper. It's like God's mocking me, saying, have you prayed about it? Right? Have you invited me into your electrical, mechanical stuff? And you know what the answer generally is? No. I'm sorry. You know, self-sufficiency or God sufficiency? Every single day, we have that choice. Am I going to do things in my own strength, with my own wisdom, or am I going to trust God to guide me? You know, a self-sufficient attitude says, God, I've got this, right? Which is why people lie. because we want to do things in our own strength. But a God-sufficient mindset says, God, I trust you, and I need you to work on my behalf. You know, last week, David Potts was here, and we interviewed him. And one of the ways that we closed out our conversation was we just said, God, please go before him, right? Give him favor as he's going on these high school campuses. What are we doing? We're asking God to help us. We're trying to have a God-sufficiency as opposed to a self-sufficiency. Look at the last verse in this chapter, Proverbs chapter 21, verse 31. Look what it says. It says, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. Translation: I have a part, you have a part in our wealth building, but God has a part to fulfill as well. It's a team effort. I do my part, I do my good planning, my pleasure moderation, my saving and my sharing, and then I trust God to do his part, right? To fulfill his promises. That he will follow through when I step out in faith and I give away 10% of his income. My part, his part. This past week, I introduced to the Costa Mesa Police Department a candidate, an individual who is interested in becoming a police chaplain. This particular individual was a detective, a high-ranking detective in the Garden Grove Police Department, and then he felt God leading him to take a demotion and go and work for the Orange County Sheriff's Department, to which he's doing, and now he's running all of security. He's the head of security for the Bank of California, and so think about where the Bank of California is. He's there, but it's a Christian brother. And about 3 years ago, he approached me and he said, Mike, I've watched your involvement in the police department these last 2 decades. And he said, is there any place for me to possibly join the team? And well, then COVID hit, and everything was shut down and whatnot. Well, this last Thursday, I finally was able to invite him in to meet with a group of people to say, hey, here's a potential candidate for us. I want you to meet him before we start to take him through the interview process and do the background checks, and which I'm sure he's going to do fine on, and vet him. And we had this really nice 1-hour conversation with a potential police chaplain. Well, as I escorted him out of the police department, and as we were standing out in the lobby before we left the building, he made a statement to me. He said, Mike, I really want to be a part of this police chaplain ministry. He said, at the same time, I recognize that it's all in God's hands. It's in God's hands. And in that moment, he didn't know what I was going to talk about this morning, but I thought that's a good balance, right? Between I do my part, I do my skills, I sharpen my sword, I get ready for the battle, I go to the interview, but at the end of the day, God needs to do his part. And if God really wants me to be, what he was saying is, if God really wants me to be a chaplain with the Costa Mesa Police Department, he's going to make things happen. So friends, again, wealth building, I do my part. Again, I do my good planning. I do my pleasure moderation. I do my saving and sharing. And then I trust that God does his part. That he will meet my needs. That he will grow my faith. As well as my financial fortune. Yes? And this, brothers and sisters, is biblical wisdom to live by. So let's close in prayer. We're here today. We're here to learn. We're here to grow. That's our part. Now let's ask God to do his part. So again, I invite you to just put everything down. Put your